Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. G20 finance ministers and central bankers held talks on Saturday aimed at spurring global economic recovery from a coronavirus-triggered recession amid growing calls to widen debt relief for crisis-hit poor countries. The dignitaries pledged to use all available policy tools to safeguard people's lives, jobs and incomes as the coronavirus pandemic continues to wreak havoc on the global economy. The grouping, however, failed to reach an agreement on the possibility of allocating fresh special drawing rights to member countries or reallocating SDRs from rich members to countries facing a liquidity crisis because of the COVID-19 pandemic. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the G20 Finance Ministers Meet and what it means for the global economic crisis. Joining me on the program today are Jayant Dasgupta, former ambassador of India at the WTO, Swaran Singh, Chairperson, Center for International Politics, JNU, and Jitendranath Mishra, former ambassador. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. All right, Mr. Dasgupta, let me begin the program with you first. What were the key takeaways really as far as the G20 Finance Ministers Meet was concerned from an economic point of view, and where does the global economy stand as of now?
The G20 finance ministers were quite happy with the implementation of the G20 Finance Ministers Action Plan of 15th April 2020. And that was the first thing which they endorsed. Now, if we look at the action plan, there were several issues which were flagged there and action was supposed to be taken. The first one was about economic recovery. The second one was about health response. The third one dealt with sustainability of the recovery process. And the final aspect, if we can say it in so many words, it was about a coordinated response amongst all the G20 partners. So on all these counts, I think the G20 finance ministers found that enough action had been taken, and it will be further reviewed in October 2020 in their next meeting. As far as the details are concerned, our finance minister mentioned the action taken by India on various points of the action plan. And she outlined that we had rolled out a $295 billion plan to take care of the various aspects of recovery from the COVID pandemic. The first one was about the credit response. The second one was about providing food and cash benefit transfers, direct benefit transfers. The third one was about support to the MSMEs, which form the backbone of our industry. And the G20 also strongly endorsed the points of the action plan on providing financial inclusion to women, youth, and MSMEs, because there are many countries which are very heavily dependent on these segments to perform well to enable a full recovery. The two or three other major points which I wanted to mention in this context is that the Financial Action Task Force, which monitors terrorist financing, that was re-endorsed the commitment to make it effective and to monitor it very strongly, robustly. And the third thing was to keep an eye out on new methods of terror financing and to clamp down on them. The next point is about the debt service suspension initiative, because there are many low-income countries which are unable to service their debts. So about $5.3 billion was to be deferred for this. And the World Bank and IMF and other international financial institutions had to come together. And there is also a call in the communique of yesterday for private lenders to join hands and to take an active part in debt service suspension for some time.
Okay. A substantive meeting, and we look forward to the next meeting is what Ambassador Dasgupta is suggesting. Ambassador Mishra, as far as the G20 is concerned, do you believe that the grouping has done enough over the last 4 to 5 months? There are several people who believe that, the G20 could have done more and should have done more. As a multilateral organization, are there any limitations? How much can the G20 actually do?
Thank you very much, Frank, for inviting me on the program. I'm delighted to be here. Ambassador Dasgupta has very nicely covered what the meeting accomplished and what the meeting accomplished in relation to the previous meeting in April, and also the way forward. I would like to give a slightly different perspective, if I may, in terms of what they actually said in the meeting and what the goals are. I won't delve into data too much, but I'm just looking at these figures. The meeting said what it endorsed actually. It said it will consider debt relief for coronavirus hit poor countries. Consider. Please emphasize the word consider. Now, this kind of language is very common in international multilateral institutions. We have a history of the word consider being used in so many documents and so many declarations for decades and more. Of course, in the 1970s, we had the new international economic order, then we had the Millennium Development Goals. No country in that period, in the new international economic order, reached aid targets of 1% of GDP. No country. I think the Swedes reached 0.7%. So the world is not a philanthropic world. The real world is it's a stingy place. Nation states are stingy. So intent is all right. Considering things is all right, but doing things is different. Now, in the multilateral system, as we all know, going to the United Nations, the one organ of the United Nations that is authorized to take mandatory action under Chapter 7 is the Security Council when there are threats to peace. It can take military action, it can do sanctions, economic action. But that also is facing bottlenecks because of the veto power of the P5, and one country vetoes the resolution, you just can't act. So the multilateral bodies are very good. They are the way forward. But even at a time of crisis like this, is the world doing enough? My answer would be, unfortunately, it's not doing enough. The meeting on Saturday, it announced a one-year debt standstill for the world's poorest nations in April, actually. It announced in April, but this was criticized as woefully inadequate. People are looking at 2 years or 3 years. Oxfam talked about 3 years, and I think the IMF talked about till the end of 2021. But that's not what's happened. Then again, I'm using the language, it will consider extension of the debt service suspension initiative, which Ambassador Dasgupta referred to. Again, consider. It didn't say it will do it. It just said it will consider doing it. So that's the language. In the second half of 2020, another caveat, depending on the COVID-19 situation. So they will wait and watch how the situation unfolds, and then they will consider. So there are two caveats here. So are they going to actually do it? I'm very doubtful that they will do it to the extent that they have promised. Right. Having said that, vulnerable countries, they pay $92 million a day on debt. $92 million, that's the data. And debt suspension is only 5.3 million or 12% of debt payment due in 2020, $5.3 billion. So 12% has been achieved. So that's certainly, I'm not going to be pessimistic, it's a way forward.
Okay, all right. Professor, talking about multilateral organizations, COVID-19 has ensured that everyone looks inwards. Everyone is talking about, trying to help themselves out first before doing anything else. At a time like this, what is the immediate future of multilateral organizations and how much can they contribute?
Thank you. The way two ambassadors have just outlined both what happened and also provided an assessment of what was achieved and what could have been achieved is a reflection of something very interesting of what is happening to multilateralism, particularly from a perspective of diplomacy. See, G20 today represents about 85% of global economy. There could not be a better platform to discuss how to create that resilience, particularly among the least developed countries, to ensure global demand continuously rises and the deep recession can be addressed. And now if you look at this from the perspective of diplomacy, initially a lot of skepticism about whether these leaders will be able to achieve anything online in virtual meetings. But now you notice substantial details available both before and after. 16-point long communique. Along with that, whole lot of progress reports on the action plan and other reviews and reports, documents being placed both for the foreign finance ministers and central bank governors, and also to all of us. So I think it's an enormous upgradation of how virtual diplomacy can still be very effective. And I think that was an enormous challenge to overcome in that sense. And even for this, for example, CBGs, this is the third meeting after the initial March 26 virtual summit meeting that happened. So I want to underline the pace and detail of what is being achieved by the largest group of economies called G20. Now, of course, there is half glass full, that approach can apply here, but a lot of innovative approaches are being, I think, considered here, both of activating the mechanisms, the platforms that already exist. For example, catastrophe containment and relief trust is created, which is addressing requests now of 27 countries. Likewise, IMF has also fast-paced its requests. About 80 countries requests for about 60 billion SDRs already processed. About 30 others are still pending. So whole lot of fast-paced approach, innovation of alternative possibilities. The chief economist, for example, Geeta Gopinath was telling us in June last month how IMF is already considering the unused SDRs could be disbursed or redistributed among the least developed nations to ensure that demand can be still raised. So I think we have to look at the challenges that global diplomacy and multilateral diplomacies faced when they were not able to meet face to face, and how quickly they are adopting to this new platform of interacting online and taking initiatives, and at each stage both reactivating things that already existed and also looking at alternative ways of addressing several of these things. All the countries are on board. Nobody is kind of amiss in providing that kind of feedback and then taking initiatives. Of course, the international financial architect working group would not succeed in that two countries, actually both India and United States, did not agree that we should allow disbursement of SDRs at this stage. Answer is very clear. First of all, India has repeatedly said SDR disbursal should be not the first port of call. First port of call should be what already countries have in terms of their foreign exchange reserves. India has repeatedly said that we should look at various alternatives. And for example, in April last month, the same FMCVGs had started something called DSSI, Debt Suspension Initiative, which was just mentioned, how that is already cleared for this particular year, $5.3 billion of debt repayments not to be serviced this year. They are also calling in, as was mentioned, the private creditors to accept and become part of DSSI. So I want to underline the kind of energy, the kind of synergy and kind of innovation that is occurring and quick adaptation to the new platforms. And therefore, G20, I think, is the best possible kind of source that we have at this stage to build that resilience in global economy, which is under enormous stress. And I think they have done fairly, appreciable work so far. And the work is continuing. So in that sense, till November this year, Saudi Arabia taking the lead of all these initiatives is another interesting thing, because it's not United States or China taking the lead, it's Saudi Arabia taking the lead. So Saudi Arabia also is showing credentials of being able to be the leader in such a situation. We need to underline that. So I look at it in terms of fairly optimistic scenario. And I think we will see some of more things happening, because challenge is enormous. Both crisis, financial crisis, political polarization. So crises are enormous. In front of those crises, I think it's a fairly appreciable work so far.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me just take these points that the professor is making forward with you, Ambassador Dasgupta. There's no doubt that, G20 is a great platform. It makes up for about 85% of the world economy. But therein lies another problem, doesn't it? Because the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the world so much that all these countries individually too are going through a massive economic crisis. So when they themselves are going through an economic crisis, how much can they do for the other countries?
That is indeed true. If you look at countries like Britain, for instance, they have rolled out a massive economic rejuvenation plan. And at the moment, it seems unclear as to how they will fund that initiative. So there would be other instances also. From China, we don't really know what kind of fiscal and monetary stimulus they have provided. In the US also, a massive amount of money has already been pledged and is getting spent. $2,000 per individual has already been transferred to the bank accounts of people in the US. And we have also taken similar measures according to our ability and affordability. So there is a huge drain on the existing financial resources of countries. It is undoubtedly true. The second point is, because the economy is not doing well, tax collection is a huge problem. So if we commit to do something and in the next few months we are unable to raise the resources, it's not possible for us to do it. And this is the case with many countries. So it is taking small steps at a time and taking them together so that there is a coordinated response and all of us swim rather than sink individually. The point that I also wanted to make is that the G20 is not a formal organization in which, there is a binding kind of commitment that one takes when one agrees to, the resolutions that are passed. So it is a very good initiative in the sense that without the kind of formal binding that, for instance, the UN organizations have or the WTO has, where you can take another country which has not fulfilled its obligations to the dispute settlement body, or for other international treaty organizations where you can approach the International Court of Justice or the Permanent Forum for Arbitration. In the case of the G20, it is purely voluntary. So whatever one does is, of one's own accord. And the last point I wanted to make is, look at the Financial Action Task Force. For all the countries which have tried to help our neighbor, it has still worked effectively in the sense that Pakistan has had to clamp down on terrorist financing and when many of the terrorist organizations which were moving around unhindered in Pakistan. So I think we have to draw the line at international cooperation. The country's interest will come first. The country's resources and economic viability and ability to finance things will come next. So considering all these parameters, I think the G20 has performed well. Okay.
Ambassador, Mishra, let's look at another aspect now, the aspect that that Professor raised. It's nice to see someone like Saudi Arabia and someone other than China and the United States for a change taking the lead and doing something and putting their best foot forward. But at some level, we've noticed in the recent past, at least over the last year and a half, ever since the US-China trade, differences began, the fixation of the world certainly seems to be on China and the United States. And beyond a point, people can't look beyond the US and China.
Well, absolutely. As I said, we are still in a Westphalian world. That's the reality of the international system. We have not moved away from that. I really like the optimism expressed by Professor Singh and the positive comments about the work of the G20 made by Ambassador Dasgupta. I entirely agree with them. I mean, we had $5.3 billion of debt relief, which is 12% in a few months. So there is a response to the crisis, as we agree. But there is a tremendous distraction from the crisis, as you have suggested, Frank, just now. And that distraction is that there is a much bigger power game going on, And unfortunately, I will talk about China because I've been studying China very carefully in the context of what's happening in our own northern borders, obviously. And what we are seeing in the South China Sea, what we are seeing in Hong Kong, the Senkaku-Diaoyu Island dispute, or in Ladakh, all this, or the differences with Australia, the trade sanctions against Australia threatened, and of course the dispute with the United States. Now China is at the center of all the disputes that are the major disputes of the world in the current year, and all this really blew on our faces just as the COVID crisis broke. What does it mean? It means that China is, unfortunately, rather than showing great statesmanship and being lofty and trying to find a solution in terms of its great capabilities as the number 2 economy in the world, instead of doing that, China has taken the other route of trying to leverage the crisis that all of us are collectively facing to prosecute and to promote its national interests as China sees it. And we are all feeling the heat of that. And therefore, a country like Saudi Arabia doing what it does is something we have to be grateful for. Saudi Arabia has actually shown statesmanship. I really wish that China had shown the same kind of statesmanship. Even the United States, even the others. What's happening to the EU? The EU is now in the doldrums. It's in the background.
Right.
Brexit has distracted the United Kingdom. We can go on and on. So, and India, I have to add here, and I have to, as Ambassador Dasgupta very rightly said, we have to take national action because this is a voluntary body. It's an excellent body because it's actually a virtual body even without virtual diplomacy because it doesn't have a secretariat. And that makes costs are much less. It doesn't become like a big kind of a white elephant. So India has done quite well. You know, the digital, especially I'd like to say, as the minister said, Minister Sitharaman said, the digital transfers of funds and of relief to the poorest people, that's been a success.
Absolutely. So Professor, talking about India now and looking at how the world economy is this an opportunity for India to step up and, and take its rightful place at the global high table?
There is absolutely no doubt that each crisis comes out with its own challenges, but also opportunities. And it is for historic leaders at such stage to how to convert that challenge into an opportunity. India luckily has several advantages at this stage. First of all, shifting to virtual diplomacy. India has English language. India has savviness to IT platforms at all levels. India is a democracy, so used to hearing discordant voices and finding consensus. More than that, you look at this, it is a health crisis to begin with. India is the chairman of Executive Board of World Health Organization. Indian official is the overseas auditor of WHO. Deputy Director General is an Indian pediatrician. Look at IMF. The chief economist is an Indian, Geeta Gopinath. So Indians are sitting at several important positions. Also, several Indians sitting in very, very important positions in multinationals. Now, if you connect it to the fact that IMF report said only 2 countries will be leading the global growth rates, India 2020, India and China. And according to IMF, we may not agree, but IMF believes India's growth rate is going to be even sharper and higher, 1.9% compared to China's 1.2%. So there is no doubt that there is a global deep recession, there is a shrinking of global economy, each national economy is having a hit. But relatively, in such a situation, some countries are empowered relatively to do perhaps little better. And the fact that, mention was just made by Ambassador Mishra, how Chinese are again focusing on national interests and how globalism has been very central to Indian DNA. Even Atmanirbharta was recently clearly defined because there was some confusion. Prime Minister clarified what that Atmanirbharta means. It's self-reliance with engagement with the world. So, our civilizational DNA makes us much comfortable at home and finds our gravitation point in engaging the world. And my last point, it doesn't matter who is, growing faster, who is growing slower. World is today so closely connected that no nation can autonomously do better compared to others. So as long as we are not able to germinate the global demand, and in that, poorest economies will be giving us the highest per dollar returns. And in that sense, focus has to be on the least developed nations. And I think G20 is clearly doing that. And we are all connected. And unless everybody comes together, and very last 5 seconds, if you allow me, both ambassadors fully understand that today is the world of networks. Secretariats and structural organizations are now dated. So G20 actually for me represents the future way of conducting international diplomacy compared to IMF or World Bank. So I wouldn't at all think the fact that it is not a secretarial based international organization becomes its great limitation. I don't see that as a limitation. I think they are representing the futuristic way of conducting international policy, international diplomacy.
Absolutely. Okay, I've got about 2 minutes left on the program, so I'm going to ask my panelists to all be brief in 30 seconds each, the best way forward, starting with you, Mr. Dasgupta.
One of the things which I wanted to point to was the kind of competition that the IMF and the World Bank are getting from China, from the institutions that the Chinese have set up. And that also has led to the quick response of the IMF and World Bank. Of course, they could have done it even otherwise, but it has prompted them to take very quick action. So competition is very good even in international diplomacy. That is the first point. The last point I wanted to make is that there is a scope for greater coherence in taking action. And one of the things which I wanted to mention is that China, one of the best ways to do it is through a forum like the G20, rather than taking things up in various fora like the UN organizations or other places. So this affords us one of the best opportunities, and we must use it to prevent unilateral action by other countries as well, including the US, if possible.
Right. Okay, yes, Mr. Mishra.
I entirely agree with Master Dasgupta and Professor Singh. The G20 is an excellent forum because it's not divisive in the way that, well, we are talking about expansion of the G7, for example, and China has responded very sharply to that. Now, at a pragmatic level, we have to take China on board because it's the number 2 economy in the world. And luckily, it is in the G20. So it's inclusive. So there has to be some kind of a grand bargain among the major powers and other members of the G20 to take at least minimal pragmatic steps. And they are doing this, as we discussed, but needs to be carried forward. That's the way forward. And at the same time, national action has to be alert, proactive, and successful, as has been the case of digital transfers in India. We had $10 billion transferred to 420 million people, which I think is a success story.
All right. And Professor, quick closing comment from you.
If we look at the enormity of challenge of health crisis, financial crisis, political polarization, there are going to be limitations. But I think it's a good sign that neither China nor United States in such crisis time is heading the G20. It's Saudi Arabia. So there is a greater possibility of building consensus. It's a good sign that they are quickly adopting, all nations and their leaders are quickly adopting to virtual diplomacy. It's a good sign that they are sharing all these documents with common people. We can access these documents. And that I think is a good way of indirectly ensuring compliance, which are fundamentally going to be national initiatives. And I think that way it is a kind of a move towards future. And I think that is what we needed in crisis time like this.
Okay, all right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. The G20 finance ministers were happy with the outcome of the meet, but the world is not doing enough. We need to do a lot more. Language that is used needs to be a little more positive as well. When world leaders talk about consider, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is extremely positive, is what the panelists are suggesting. G20 is a great platform, and the world is indeed going through a very difficult phase and a difficult time. but we have to take baby steps and take everyone along, and only then will we all swim together and not sink, is what the panelists are suggesting. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.